The winter he didn't come, she stood at the window for 3 hours, watching the empty porch railing where a crow had landed every November for 12 straight years, and somewhere in her chest, something quietly broke that she knew would never fully heal. Snow fell soft and silent that morning, the kind of snow that muffles the whole world, and Eleanor Whitfield pressed her palm flat against the cold glass like she could reach through it and pull him back by sheer will alone. 12 years. 12 winters of that same black shape dropping out of a gray sky. 12 years of a small gift left on the rail. 12 years of a bond. Nobody would have believed if she'd tried to explain it to a stranger. And now, on the 13th November, the rail sat bare, dusted white, untouched. She waited until the light went gray, and then blue, and then dark, and still nothing came. Have you ever loved something that couldn't promise you it would stay? Something wild, something that owed you nothing, and yet chose you anyway, year after year, until the day it simply didn't? That question sat with Eleanor long before that empty November morning, though she wouldn't have called it a question back then. Back then it was just a Tuesday in early November 13 years earlier. Cold enough that her breath fogged in front of her on the walk from the mailbox, and she almost didn't see him at all. He was tucked against the base of the old maple at the edge of her yard, a heap of black feathers so still she thought at first it was a garbage bag the wind had carried in. It was the sound that stopped her. A low, ragged croak, more air than voice, the sound of something trying to speak with nothing left to speak with. She was 61 years old that autumn, 3 years widowed, living alone in the same farmhouse she and her husband Walter had bought back when they were newly married, and the whole world still felt like it was ahead of them instead of behind. The house had 2 empty bedrooms upstairs that used to belong to children who had long since grown and moved to cities with better jobs and busier lives. And most days the loudest sound in that house was the ticking of the kitchen clock. She hadn't planned on kneeling in the frozen grass that morning. She hadn't planned on much of anything since Walter passed, if she was honest with herself. But something about that small, broken shape under the maple tree pulled her down onto her knees before her mind had even decided to move. The crow's left wing hung wrong, twisted at an angle no healthy wing should ever twist, and one eye was crusted half shut with dried blood. He didn't fight her when she wrapped him in her scarf. That was the thing that stayed with her for years afterward. He didn't fight her. Somewhere in that small skull, something in him understood that the hands lifting him weren't the hands of a predator. Or maybe he was simply too weak to fight, too far gone to do anything but let it happen. Eleanor liked to believe it was the first thing. She needed to believe it was the first thing. She carried him inside, laid him in a shoebox lined with an old flannel shirt of Walter's that she still hadn't been able to give away, and sat on the kitchen floor beside him until well past midnight, listening to his breathing, terrified every time it caught and stuttered that it might not start again. Do you remember the first time an animal chose to trust you? Not because you fed it, not because you owned it, but because in some quiet moment it looked at you and decided, against every instinct telling it to run, that you were safe. That feeling doesn't leave you. It sits in your chest for the rest of your life. Eleanor didn't sleep that first night. She drove 40 minutes the next morning to the only wildlife rehabilitation place within 100 miles, a cramped clinic run by a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Marisol Reyes, who took one look at the crow's wing under the light and said the word Eleanor had been dreading. Broken. Not shattered, not beyond hope, but broken badly enough that it would take weeks, maybe months, and there was no guarantee he'd ever fly the same again. Most people don't bother, Dr. Reyes told her, snapping off her gloves. Crows aren't exactly the animal people drive 40 minutes to save. He's not most animals, Eleanor said, though she couldn't have explained why she believed that, not yet, not with any evidence beyond the way his one good eye had followed her face the whole ride over. She named him Jasper, after nothing in particular. It was just the name that came to her mind while she watched him try and fail to stand on the exam table, wobbling like a drunk sailor on a rocking ship. Dr. Reyes showed her how to build a proper enclosure in the mudroom, how to feed him a mixture of soaked cat food and mealworms, how to keep the wings splinted and still, how to watch for infection in the eye. It was more work than Eleanor had done for anything in years. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed something to be work for. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't known she was starving for. 6 in the morning, before the sun cracked the horizon, she'd shuffle into the mudroom in Walter's old robe and find Jasper already awake, that one good eye tracking her from across the enclosure with an intelligence that unsettled her at first, and then, slowly, began to comfort her. Crows are smart. She learned that quickly, reading everything she could find at the library. Articles that talked about tool use and facial recognition and memory that could last years. But no article prepared her for the specific, particular way Jasper watched her. Not the way a dog watches you, desperate and open. Something colder, sharper, more evaluating. Like he was deciding something about her, testing her, every single day. By the second week, his appetite came roaring back, and by the third he'd started making noise whenever she left the mudroom, a series of clicks and low, rattling croaks that she swore, though she'd never have said it out loud to anyone, sounded almost like conversation. She talked back to him. She told herself it was ridiculous, a grown woman narrating her grocery list to an injured bird, but the house had been so quiet for so long that even a bird's clicking felt like company worth having. The wing healed slower than Dr. Reyes had hoped. 6 weeks became 8. 8 became 10. Eleanor drove him back for checkups, sat in the waiting room with the shoebox on her lap while a golden retriever 3 chairs down eyed the box with obvious suspicion, and each time Dr. Termes. Reyes would press gently along the mended bone and nod, cautiously pleased, cautiously worried. He may never fly like a wild crow again, she warned Eleanor more than once. You should prepare yourself for that. Eleanor didn't want to prepare herself for that. She wanted, with an intensity that surprised her, for this bird to fly. By late February, the enclosure in the mudroom had grown too small for what Jasper needed. He'd taken to hopping onto the highest perch she'd built for him and flapping, hard, testing the wing, wincing, or what she interpreted as wincing, that flinch of the head, every time he pushed it too far. She started leaving the mudroom door cracked into the kitchen, and within days he was exploring the whole downstairs, landing on the back of Walter's old recliner, inspecting the salt shaker on the kitchen table with one curious eye, stealing a bottle cap off the counter, and hiding it behind the toaster like it was something precious. That was the first time she saw it, the collecting. Small, shiny things, disappearing into little hoards around her kitchen, a dropped earring back, a gum wrapper with foil lining, a paperclip. She'd find them tucked in odd corners, and she never once got angry about it, not even when he made off with one of her good spoons. Something about watching him gather these small treasures, hide them, guard them, made her feel like she was witnessing something private and important, some piece of who he really was underneath the injury and the fear. By April, Jasper was flying laps around her kitchen, clumsy at first, clipping the ceiling fan once and knocking a picture frame off the wall in a panic that left them both rattled for an hour afterward. But he kept trying. Every day, a little farther, a little steadier, Dr. Cruz. Reyes came out to the house herself in early May to check on him, watched him take off from the kitchen table and land, a little roughly, on top of the refrigerator, and let out a breath. Eleanor hadn't realized the doctor had been holding for months. "He's ready, Dr. Stan." Reyes said, "You did good, Eleanor." Really good. Nobody had told Eleanor she'd done good at anything in a long time. She cried in the kitchen after Doctor. Reyes left, standing at the sink with dish soap still on her hands, while Jasper watched her from the top of the cabinets with his head tilted, clicking softly, like he was asking what was wrong. She knew what came next. She'd known since the day Dr. Reyes first said the word broken. A healed wild animal doesn't belong in a mudroom in a farmhouse. It belongs in the sky, in the trees, wherever crows are meant to be. But knowing a thing and being ready for it are two very different animals themselves. She waited until the 3rd week of May, until the mornings had turned soft and warm and the maple tree at the edge of the yard had gone fully green, the same tree where she'd found him curled and broken 6 months before. She carried him outside in her 2 bare hands. He'd let her hold him like that for weeks now. No cage, no box, just her palms cupped beneath him. And stood in the grass in her nightgown and Walter's old work boots, and she opened her hands. He didn't leave right away. He sat there on her palms for a long moment, that one good eye fixed on her face, and something passed between them in that silence that Eleanor would spend the next 12 years trying to put into words and never quite managing. Then he lifted off, awkward at first, and climbed, until he was just a black shape circling once, twice, 3 times above the house, and then he was gone over the tree line, and Eleanor stood alone in her yard with her empty hands still cupped in front of her like she was still holding something. She went inside and cried harder than she had at any point during his recovery. She told herself it was relief. She told herself it was pride. She didn't let herself say the real word for weeks, and when she finally did say it, alone at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, the word was loss. Summer passed, then fall. Eleanor kept up her routine out of habit more than hope. She still glanced at the maple tree every morning out of the kitchen window, still found herself listening for that particular rattling croak whenever a crow called somewhere in the distance, and every single time it wasn't him, a small piece of her sank a little further. She told herself this was foolish. Crows don't remember people, she told herself. Crows don't come back. She'd released a wild animal back into a wild world, and wild things don't stay tethered to a farmhouse kitchen out of gratitude. That wasn't how nature worked. She'd read enough at the library to half believe it, even if some stubborn corner of her heart refused to fully let go. Then came the 1st week of November, almost exactly a year after she'd found him under the maple tree, and Eleanor walked out to get her mail and stopped dead in the driveway. A crow sat on the porch railing, watching her, head tilted at an angle she recognized instantly, bone deep, in a way that made the hair rise on her arms before her mind had even caught up to what her body already knew. She approached slowly, heart hammering, telling herself it couldn't be. It was a coincidence. There were 1,000 crows in this county, and any one of them could land on any porch on any given morning. But when she got within 10 feet, the bird made a sound, that same low, rattling croak, unmistakable, a voice she would have known anywhere, a voice she'd fallen asleep listening to for months in her mudroom, and something small and metallic glinted on the railing beneath his feet. A bottle cap. Eleanor didn't move for a long time. She stood in her driveway with the mail forgotten in her hand and stared at that bottle cap and that bird and felt the whole last year rearrange itself in her chest. He had come back. He had flown God knows how far, through a whole wild crow's life she knew nothing about, and he had chosen, on his own, with no cage and no need, to land on her porch railing and leave her a gift. She learned later from an article she found buried deep in an ornithology journal at the library that crows are known to remember specific human faces for years, sometimes for the crow's entire lifetime, and that they're known to hold something that researchers, cautiously, almost reluctantly, call gratitude. She read that word standing in the periodicals section of the library, and she had to sit down on the little stool in the corner because her knees had gone soft. That was the beginning of the rhythm that would define the next 12 years of Eleanor Whitfield's life. Every November, in that same first week, sometimes the exact same day, Jasper would appear on her porch railing, and every single time he left something behind. A bottle cap the first year, a small brass button the second, a shard of blue sea glass, worn smooth, the third. She had no idea where in the world he'd found sea glass, given they were 140 miles from any coast, and that mystery alone kept her up at night with wonder. A fishing lure, hook carefully removed by some means she never understood, in year 4. A child's plastic ring, the kind that comes from a gumball machine, in year 5. Each object went into a jar on her windowsill above the kitchen sink, and each November the jar got a little fuller, and each November Eleanor got a little older, and the crow, impossibly, against every rule of wild things she'd ever read, kept coming back. She never fed him during those visits. She'd learned enough by then to know that wasn't the point, that whatever this was between them didn't run on breadcrumbs or mealworms. Sometimes he'd stay an hour, hopping along the railing, watching her through the kitchen window while she did dishes, occasionally making that clicking sound she'd once mistaken for nonsense and now understood, in some wordless animal way, as conversation. Other times he'd land, leave his gift, and be gone within minutes, off to wherever the rest of his crow life happened, a life Eleanor knew almost nothing about and had long since stopped needing to know. It was enough that he came. It was enough that, out of an entire world he was free to roam, he chose, every year, to remember her. Her children worried about her, in the gentle, condescending way grown children worry about aging parents living alone. Her daughter Susan called every November after Eleanor mentioned the crow's visit, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think you might be losing your grip on reality. "Mom, are you sure it's the same bird?" Susan would ask, not unkindly but not quite believing either. "Crows all kind of look the same, don't they?" Eleanor never argued the point too hard. She understood how it sounded from the outside. A widow living alone in a farmhouse, convinced a wild bird remembered her, collecting a jar of small objects like a woman guarding evidence of something nobody else could see. She let Susan believe what she needed to believe, and she kept her own certainty close, private, sacred, in a way she didn't feel the need to defend to anyone. She knew. She knew it in the specific tilt of his head, the particular rasp in his croak, the way he'd land closer to the window every year, like trust was something that compounded with interest. The years did what years do. Walter had been gone 9 years by the time of Jasper's 5th visit, and Eleanor had settled into a version of her life that was quieter than she'd once imagined, but not, she came to realize, an unhappy one. She had her garden, her library trips, her Sunday calls with the grandchildren, and she had November, which had become, without her ever quite deciding it, the most important month of her year. She'd start watching the sky in late October, the way other people watch the mail for a birthday card. She'd find herself talking to the empty porch railing in September, telling it to hold on, he'd be back soon. The 6th year brought a turning point Eleanor hadn't expected. That November, Jasper didn't come alone. He landed on the railing as always, but this time a second crow landed beside him, smaller, watchful, clearly uncertain about the strange upright creature on the other side of the glass. Eleanor held her breath, afraid to move, afraid this new arrival meant something was ending, that Jasper had found his own kind now and wouldn't need this strange yearly pilgrimage anymore. But he left his gift as always, a small copper key that fit no lock Eleanor ever found, and the second crow watched the whole exchange with an intensity that Eleanor, over time, came to understand as instruction. He was showing this other bird, a mate perhaps, or an offspring, something he considered important. He was showing her off. That was the year Eleanor allowed herself to fully believe what she'd suspected for 5 years already, that this wasn't habit or accident. This was choice, repeated on purpose, year after year, by a creature that owed her nothing and stayed anyway. The 7th year tested her in a way none of the others had. Eleanor's hip gave out that August, a bad fall on the porch steps that put her in the hospital for a week and left her leaning on a cane for months afterward, and by the time November arrived, she was barely getting around the house, let alone standing at the window watching for a crow. Her daughter had come to stay for a few weeks to help, fussing over medications and doctor's appointments, and Eleanor had nearly forgotten, in the fog of pain and pills, that the season had turned at all. It was Susan who saw him first, standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes, calling out in a voice tight with disbelief. "Mom! Mom! There's a crow on the porch and I swear it's staring right through this window at you." Eleanor made her way to the window on her cane, slower than she wanted, her hip screaming with every step, and there he was, exactly where he always was, watching the door with what she could only describe. He didn't leave when she didn't come right away. He waited. He waited nearly 40 minutes, an unusually long visit even by his standards, until Eleanor finally made it to the door and eased herself down onto the porch step beside him. He hopped closer than he'd ever hopped before, close enough that she could see the individual feathers catching the gray November light, and he left that year's gift not on the railing but directly on the step beside her cane, a smooth white stone with a natural hole worn through the center. She still doesn't know what made that year different, why he chose to close that distance the year she needed it most, but she has never once doubted that he knew. Animals know more than we give them credit for. She'd tell you that with complete conviction, no hesitation at all if you asked her. Susan didn't say another word about crows looking the same after that day. She stood at the window with tears on her face, watching her mother sit on a cold porch step with a wild bird inches from her hand, and she understood, finally, something she'd been too skeptical to understand for 6 years. The 8th and 9th years passed more gently, the way years sometimes do when you stopped waiting for the world to surprise you and started simply trusting that it will. Jasper came, left his object, a marble the 8th year, a small silver spoon, worn and tarnished, the 9th, and stayed his usual hour or two before disappearing back into whatever vast crow life carried him through the other 11 months. Eleanor's hip healed as much as it was going to heal. She grew a little slower, a little more careful on the stairs, a little more grateful for small, ordinary mornings. The jar on the windowsill kept filling. 9 objects now, 9 winters of proof, sitting in a line of afternoon light that turned the glass gold every evening around 4 o'clock. It was the 10th year that broke something open in Eleanor that she hadn't expected. That November, Jasper arrived not with a bottle cap or a button or a stone, but with a small torn piece of red ribbon, faded and weathered, tied in an amateur clumsy knot. Eleanor turned it over in her fingers on the porch step, and something about the specific shade of red, the specific clumsy knot, sent a memory crashing through her so hard she had to sit down right where she stood. It was the exact same shade Walter used to tie around the tomato stakes in the garden every spring, a habit of his she'd forgotten, until that scrap of ribbon brought the whole memory roaring back. Walter kneeling in the dirt in his straw hat, humming some tuneless song, tying red ribbon around green stakes with the careful, unhurried patience of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. She sat on that porch step and cried for her husband in a way she hadn't cried in years, not the sharp grief of the early days, but something older and gentler and somehow more complete, and the whole time Jasper sat on the railing. She has wondered, more times than she could count since, whether that ribbon was pure coincidence, some random scrap he'd found snagged on a fence somewhere with no meaning behind it at all. And she has always, every time, decided she doesn't want the answer to that question. Some mysteries are better left exactly as they are. The 11th year came and went with an ease that felt, in hindsight, like the last calm before a storm neither of them could see coming. He left a small gold-toned charm shaped like a heart, tarnished at the edges, no chain attached, origin unknown and unknowable, and it went into the jar with the rest. 11 objects now standing in that gold afternoon light, a small quiet museum of a friendship no scientist could have fully explained, and no skeptic could have fully denied, not after watching it unfold year after year in that same farmhouse kitchen. The 12th year, Eleanor was 73 years old, and something in her had begun to understand, in the quiet way that older people understand these things, that time was no longer an infinite. Crows can live 20 years or more in the wild, she'd read, sometimes longer, but Jasper had come to her already grown the year she found him, already an adult with an unknown past, which meant his age was a mystery, same as everything else about him. She found herself, that 12th November, watching the sky with a specific kind of tenderness she hadn't let herself feel in the earlier years, when the visits felt like they might simply go on forever, the way young things always feel infinite until they aren't. He came on the 2nd of November that year, a Tuesday, cold and clear, the sky scrubbed blue and empty of clouds. He landed on the railing the way he always did, and Eleanor came to the door slower than she once had, leaning on the same cane from her hip injury 5 years before, and settled herself into the rocking chair Walter had built decades ago, the one she kept on the porch specifically, if she was honest with herself, for these November mornings. Jasper hopped along the railing toward her, closer than usual, closer than even that 7th year when Susan had watched from the window in disbelief, and he left that year's gift directly in Eleanor's open palm. Not on the railing, not on the step, but placed, deliberately, into her waiting hand. A small brass bell, no bigger than a thimble, the kind that might once have hung from a cat's collar or a child's shoe, tarnished green with age and weather. She closed her fingers around it and felt something in her chest tighten with a feeling she couldn't fully name, something that sat right on the border between joy and grief, the particular ache of loving something you know you cannot keep forever. He stayed longer that day than he ever had before. Nearly 3 hours, by her count, hopping along the porch, occasionally flying a slow, lazy circle above the yard and returning, clicking softly at her from the railing while she rocked in Walter's old chair with the brass bell warm in her closed fist. When he finally left, lifting off into that scrubbed blue sky, she watched him until he was nothing but a black speck, and then nothing at all, and for the first time in 12 years, standing there on her porch, Eleanor Whitfield felt a cold certainty she couldn't shake, a feeling that settled into her bones the way weather settles before a storm arrives. She told her daughter, on their Sunday call that week, that something about this year's visit had felt like goodbye, though she couldn't explain what exactly had told her that. Susan, gentler now than she'd been in the early years, no longer skeptical, simply said, "Maybe it's not goodbye, Mom. Maybe he's just getting older, too." Eleanor wanted, desperately, to believe that was all it was. The 13th November arrived the way it always had, with Eleanor watching the sky from late October onward, checking the porch railing every morning before her coffee had even finished brewing, feeling that familiar flutter of anticipation she'd carried for 12 straight years. The first week came and went. No crow. She told herself this happened before. The 4th year, if she remembered right, he'd come nearly 2 weeks late, and she'd nearly convinced herself something terrible had happened before he finally appeared, apologetic in whatever way a bird can be apologetic, with a small glass bead clutched in his beak. So she waited. She told herself to wait. The 2nd week came and went. Still nothing. By the third week, the flutter of anticipation had curdled into something heavier, something Eleanor recognized but didn't want to name. She found herself standing at the kitchen window for long stretches, not doing dishes, not doing anything, just watching the bare gray branches of the maple tree at the edge of the yard, the same tree where this whole impossible friendship had started 13 years before with a broken wing and a desperate croak in the frozen grass. She thought about driving out to look for him, though she had no idea where she'd even begin to look, no idea what territory he claimed as his own for the other 11 months of the year, no idea if there was anything at all she could do besides wait, the same as she'd always done, the same as she'd have to keep doing. She called Dr. Cross. Reyes, retired now for several years, but still living nearby, and the old woman listened patiently on the phone while Eleanor explained, her voice cracking in places she hadn't expected it to crack. "Eleanor, Dr. Toctor." Reyes said gently after a long pause, "You gave that bird 12 years he never should have had. Most crows with a wing injury that severe don't survive the first winter in the wild, let alone come back to visit the woman who saved them for over a decade. Whatever happened to him, however this ends, you already gave him more than most animals ever get, and he gave you something back. That's not nothing, that's not small, it wasn't the comfort Eleanor wanted. It was, she came to understand over the difficult weeks that followed, the only honest comfort available. She stood at that window through the 4th week of November and into the first days of December, past the point where any reasonable person would have kept hoping, and something in her simply refused to fully let go, the way you refuse to erase a phone number for someone who has passed, the way you keep setting 2 plates out of 40 years of habit before catching yourself. She thought about the 11 objects in that jar on her windowsill, 12 if she counted the brass bell from this most recent visit, which she did, every single time, holding that small tarnished bell up to the light some evenings and turning it slowly between her fingers, listening for a faint, nearly silent ring that only she could hear in the quiet of her kitchen. Winter deepened. The snow came in earnest by mid-December, blanketing the porch railing in white, erasing even the ghost of where he used to land. Eleanor kept the mudroom door unlatched out of some superstition she couldn't fully justify to herself, some small, irrational hope that he might still find his way back, injured again perhaps, needing her the way he'd needed her at the very beginning. Nobody came. The mudroom stayed empty and cold, the same shoebox from 13 years ago still tucked on a high shelf where she'd never had the heart to throw it away. She grieved him the way she'd grieved Walter, in waves that came without warning, catching her mid-task, mid-sentence, sometimes on the phone with Susan, the words simply drying up in her throat. She grieved a creature most people in her life had never fully believed in, not really, not even after Susan's own tearful reckoning on the porch that 7th year. She grieved. She realized somewhere in that long winter, not just the bird but everything he had represented. Proof that something wild could choose to stay. Proof that love didn't require a shared language to be real. Proof that even after losing Walter, even after the house had gone quiet, something out there in the vast indifferent world had looked at her, specifically her, and decided she was worth returning to. It was late January when the letter came, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally reaching her. A handwritten note from a birdwatcher, 2 counties over, named Harold Pruitt. He'd found her name and address, he explained, through the local wildlife rehabilitation network, after Dr. Reyes, apparently, had mentioned Eleanor's story to a few colleagues over the years, the way these small remarkable things travel quietly through communities of people who understand them. Harold wrote that in early November he'd observed and photographed an old crow in his own backyard, 40 miles from Eleanor's farmhouse, a bird with a distinctive healed old injury visible in the set of its left wing, feeding at his birdbath for several days before it simply stopped appearing. He'd looked the injury up, out of curiosity, in an old regional newsletter archive and found a decade-old mention of a rehabilitated crow released from a farmhouse outside town, and something had told him to write, on the small chance it meant something to somebody. Enclosed in the envelope was a single photograph, slightly blurred, taken through a window on a gray November morning. An old crow, feathers a little more ragged than Eleanor remembered, perched on the edge of a birdbath, head tilted at an angle she would have known blindfolded, in any light, at any distance, for the rest of her life. Eleanor sat with that photograph for a long time. She didn't cry right away. She simply looked, memorizing every feather, every angle of that familiar tilted head, and let herself feel the strange, aching relief of knowing, even now, even without a final visit or a final gift left on her porch railing. He had made it that far. He had lived that long. He had, in his own way, in whatever final chapter of his own wild, unknowable life, kept going as far as a crow with a badly healed wing possibly could. She wrote Harold Pruitt a long letter back, telling him the whole story from the beginning. The broken wing under the maple tree, the shoebox on the kitchen floor, the 12 winters and 12 gifts, and the jar on the windowsill that now held everything from a bottle cap to a brass bell. She told him things she hadn't fully said out loud to anyone, not even Susan, about what those visits had meant to a widow living alone with 2 empty bedrooms and a silence she'd never learned how to fill. Harold wrote back within the week, gentle and kind, and the two of them kept up a correspondence for years afterward, 2 people bound together by one old crow neither of them would ever fully understand. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does after a long, hard winter, but it came. Eleanor kept the jar on her windowsill exactly where it had always sat, 12 small objects catching the afternoon light every day around 4 o'clock, and she added nothing new to it, and somehow that felt right, felt complete in a way that surprised her. She didn't need a 13th object. 12 years, 12 gifts, a friendship that had asked for nothing and given everything. There was nothing incomplete about that number, nothing that needed finishing. She still watches the maple tree every autumn, out of a habit 13 years deep now, one that she suspects she will never fully break for the rest of her life. Some Novembers, she catches herself standing at that window a little longer than she needs to, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the bare branches against a gray sky, half expecting, even now, even knowing better, to see a familiar black shape drop out of the clouds and land exactly where it always used to land. It never comes. But Eleanor has made her peace, slowly, gently, the way she made her peace with losing Walter. Not by forgetting, never by forgetting, but by understanding that some love doesn't need forever to be real, that 12 years of a wild thing choosing to come back was never owed to her in the first place, and every single one of those winters was a gift she almost didn't get to have at all. She thinks, some mornings, about that first Tuesday, about how close she came to walking right past that broken shape under the maple tree without stopping, about how one small decision to kneel down in frozen grass gave her 12 of the richest, strangest, most quietly sacred years of her whole long life. The jar still sits on her windowsill. Her grandchildren, when they visit now, ask about it every time, and Eleanor tells them the whole story from the beginning, watching their young faces shift from polite interest to genuine wonder, somewhere around the 7th year, the year Susan finally believed. She tells them that the world is fuller of quiet, impossible loyalty than most people ever notice, that sometimes the wildest things carry the deepest gratitude, that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that if you're patient enough, and gentle enough, and willing enough to kneel down in the frozen grass for something broken and small, you might just be given something better. Have you ever had something in your own life? An animal, a person, a moment that came back to you year after year, asking for nothing, simply because it remembered you? Have you ever kept something small on a windowsill or in a drawer that means nothing to anyone else in the world but everything to you? Tell Eleanor's story to somebody today who needs to believe that loyalty like this still exists. And if this kind of story moved something in you the way it moved something in her, leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done that Tuesday morning under the maple tree. Tell us if you believe he knew, all along, exactly what he was doing. If you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because every single week we bring you a new story just like this one, a story that will touch your heart and remind you that the quietest kinds of loyalty are often the deepest ones. Like this video, share it with somebody who needs a little hope today, and we'll see you in the next story.